So we talked about how one of the ways Gothic emerges in Victorian literature is in urban Gothic, in stories in which the city, instead of the big spooky castle-like house, the city, especially London, becomes this place of dark passageways, eerie corners, strange, complicated passageways, and with monsters looking in them. Of course, the monsters in this case are typically the urban monsters of criminals and killers. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we get this kind of benighted, labyrinthine London, full of fog, complicated, dead-end streets, scary characters around every corner. And London at the time that Jekyll and Hyde was written, and for most of the second half of the 19th century, was this surprisingly scary place. It was a big shock to the people of the time that most of whom had grown up in an agricultural landscape, to move to the city. There's a big migration to the city. The city grows up very fast. There's a lot of quickly built, shoddy workmanship. You have these narrow alleyways, these narrow winding streets, these buildings that seem to be toppling over. It seems like some kind of nightmare labyrinth or fairy tale maze. And this becomes very much a part of the imaginative structure of Gothic in the late Victorian period. And architecture becomes very central to how the city's architecture, to how we understand Gothic. I know I'm obsessed with Gustave Doré. Here's some of his etchings portraying Victorian London. These are homeless people sleeping under a bridge. You see the masts down by the River Thames in the background. And this figure of the Jack the Ripper character, the kind of gentleman serial killer who stalks the streets at night, we see in Jekyll and Hyde, and this was one of the great bogeymen of the time. Here's a passage from Jekyll and Hyde. This is from the chapter called The Carew Murder Case, which gives you a sense of this nightmare world of London in the late Victorian period. It was by this time about 9 in the morning and the first fog of the season. So fogs in London, this was actually a weird meteorological phenomenon which historical weather people, which I guess that's a strange job, but people who study the history of weather don't quite understand why it was that the fogs were so intense. Some argue it had to do with the pollution, since there was so much coal smoke in the air. Some argue it was some complicated thing about the mud in the River Thames. But by all accounts, fogs got very, very thick, and almost so thick you couldn't see through them. So this becomes part of this fantastic atmosphere of Victorian London. A great chocolate-colored pall lowered over heaven, but the wind was continually charging and routing these embattled vapors, so that as the cab crawled from street to street, Mr. Utterson beheld a marvelous number of degrees and hues of twilight. For here it would be dark like the back end of the evening, and there would be a glow of rich lurid brown like the light of some strange conflagration, and here for a moment the fog would be quite broken up, and a haggard shaft of daylight would glance in between the swirling wreaths. So in general, this landscape Mr. Utterson is in seems like some sort of infernal landscape. There's glowing fires and dark swirling clouds. The dismal quarter of Soho, seen under these changing glimpses, with its muddy ways and slatternly passengers, and its lamps, which had never been extinguished or had been kindled afresh to combat this mournful reinvasion of the darkness, seemed in the lawyer's eyes like a district of some city in a nightmare. And here's a portrayal of the London fog. You see the boy on the left is holding a torch, because you actually needed torches to make your way through this fog. It became so thick. There were practical reasons why London was a nightmarish landscape. Until the end of the century, they had no sewage system, so human waste and animal waste was all over the streets. They had no police force for most of the 19th century. There was a lot of crime. There was a great deal of poverty and social disruption. Here's another image of the thick London fog. That's why we have London fog raincoats. And so the way that the architecture works in Jekyll and Hyde bears directly on what's scary about the story. And it also bears directly on the symbolism of the identity anxiety that's at the heart of the story. In this passage, this is the passage where Mr. Utterson is walking with his friend Mr. Enfield, and Mr. Enfield is describing the first time he saw Mr. Hyde. And he describes it because as they look up, they see this building. Now the building, what they first see is this street of nice shops. This is obviously a contemporary picture, but I wanted to give you a sense. It chanced on one of these rambles that their way led them down by a street in a busy quarter of London. The inhabitants were all doing well, it seemed, and all emulously hoping to do better still. So this is a nice upper middle class street, so that the shop fronts stood along that thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. The street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighborhood like a fire in a forest, and with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. So we're in a nice part of the city. There's nice shops, there's prosperous people, everything's brightly polished, but 2 doors from one corner on the left hand going east, the line was broken by the entry of a court, and just at that point a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story, and a blind forehead of discolored wall on the upper. So in the middle of this nice street, or at the end of it, there's this ugly, beat-up, worn-down building, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and disdained. Tramps slouched into the recesses and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife in the moldings, and for close on a generation no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors or to repair the ravages. So this is sort of what that door must look like. There are these poor people, these wretched people hanging out on it. Now, if you've ever lived in a city, you know how strange it is that you'll have these very, very prosperous buildings right next to, and a homeless guy sleeping out front, or right next to a really run-down slum. And that's partly what's being described. The door in question is the door that Mr. Hyde goes into. And so you see that drastic contrast between the respectable and the disreputable. That's part of Jekyll and Hyde's identity. But what's even more interesting about this is that the door that Mr. Hyde goes into is at the back of a house that belongs to Dr. Jekyll. The front of the house is on a totally different street. Now, one of the characteristics of London at the time is its great complexity of the way the streets are set up, and there are also these little courts that made it very hard to figure out what building connected to what other building. Mr. Enfield doesn't know that Dr. Jekyll's front door, which we later see described, and it's quite well polished and well managed, has any relation to this back door, just as no one knows that Dr. Jekyll has any relation to Mr. Hyde. I wanted to show you this map. This is a map put together by William Booth. William Booth was the founder of the Salvation Army to try to help the poor in London, and he created this poverty map. And as you can see, he's categorized the different areas of the city based on how poor people were. And what you notice is that you will have these very, very poor areas in the black right next to or contiguous with, almost along the same building. Like look at this right here. In the same building as middle class and well-to-do people. You'll have them right next to one another. That combination of the two, the respectable and the disreputable, right next to one another, that's what makes Jekyll and Hyde so frightening. The darkness of the Victorian city, because as I said, in part it's heated by coal, so everything is covered with coal ash, everyone's wearing black, but also the narrowness of the streets, the darkness of the ways, create all these sort of chiaroscuro effects where you have things in shadow or tunnels or people only seen in silhouette. And it makes for dramatic Gothic scenes. Enfield's description of Hyde in the same passage in the first chapter, which is called The Story of a Door, and it's typical of this book that the chapter is actually called The Story of a Door, doors and windows. I think another one is called The Incident at the Window. So doors and windows are so important. But here's how Hyde's described when we first see him. Enfield said, "I was coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and my way lay through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps. Street after street, and all the folks asleep, street after street, all lighted up as if for a profession, and all as empty as a church." Now, street lamps were actually an innovation in late Victorian England, and it was argued that they would cut down on crime and make it more civilized. But they became themselves a sort of image of the spookiness and emptiness of the city, especially when they were surrounded by not emptiness, the spookiness and sort of nightmarish quality of the city, especially when they were surrounded by fog. And he says, "Till at last I got into the state of mind when a man listens and listens and begins to long for the sight of a policeman." And this picture would actually have a policeman, but what Enfield's saying is he starts to be afraid that there might be criminals about. He doesn't know what's going to happen. Here you see the Victorian street lamps and get a sense again of that foggy, murky quality where you can't be certain of anything. "All at once," says Enfield, "I saw two figures. One a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, that's Hyde, and the other a girl of maybe 8 or 10 who was running as hard as she was able down a cross street. Well, sir, the two ran into one another naturally enough at the corner, and then came the horrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man, it was like some damn juggernaut." I've highlighted naturally enough there because it's not really natural for a man to go trampling over a little girl. It's natural only because of the maze-like quality of the city. This man doesn't know who this girl is. They're heading toward the same street corner like two cars careening ahead, and they crash into one another. The landscape itself creates this moment, which is a moment of violence and inhuman cruelty, and the fear is that London itself is making people less human. In this huge crush of people where no one knows anybody, where everything is confusing and dark and complicated, you can lose your identity or you can hide your identity. Jekyll could only exist in the city. He couldn't exist in a small town. Everybody would figure out who he is. But the terror of the urban Gothic is in part this terror that that you don't know what's behind any door. There could be a serial killer behind any door. You don't know who anyone is, and you don't know who's coming around that dark corner.